thank you for agreeing to meet with me, gentlemen. And I guess we might as well just jump in. Last March, an ad hoc committee formed by NCI presented a set of recommendations on cancer screening trials. And how would you boil down the message of that report? Or maybe there's another way of asking it, which is what are the key issues surrounding screening and prevention trials in the publicly funded system?
Mitch, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, to me, among the most important things that committee concluded was that the trial was important. And to me, that's a statement not just of that trial, but of the importance of screening, prevention to the armamentarium of the fight against cancer. There's a tendency naturally to be focused on patients who are suffering and focused on therapeutics, which are critically important. But these trials, I think, are equally important to in preventing severe disease. And so I think first and foremost, the statement by the committee that this is an important trial and we should put effort into concluding it was, I think, a very important statement for them to make. Much appreciated. I think much of the other comments made from my perspective were fairly high-level comments focusing on the need to do everything to promote accrual and participation in the trial and execution of the trial as per the protocol, which is frankly a generic comment on any of the trials that we do. I don't know, Peter, if you want to expand on some of that.
Yeah, I think highlighting the importance of screening and prevention was a big part of the main message of the report. And I also liked the recommendation that they look into the framework of the design of these studies, feasibility, the operations supporting them. I think they put their finger on a difference between the screening and prevention studies and the therapeutic studies, and recognize that they may need to be done a little bit differently. They also suggested a portfolio analysis, which has implications of prioritization and so on. We have relatively few screening trials in the whole system, so maybe that's not an urgent requirement right now, but it is certainly, with the development of new technology, is going to become so.
What are the ECOG? What's the ECOG-ACRIN's history and interest in screening and prevention trials? By the way, we should probably just back up because the report we're talking about focused on TMIST, and we're kind of talking broader.
Well,
yeah, so I should probably address that in terms of ECOG's history. And so ECOG has participated with all of the cooperative groups in the development of prevention trials, which probably had their peak in the late 80s, early 90s, particularly. And we had two major contributions. One was through Ki Hong in a number of ECOG institutions in head and neck cancer, the role of 13-cis-retinoic acid in prevention of second primary tumors. And that was a positive study. And I don't think that it ever wound up in a huge intergroup study such as for example, the breast cancer studies, the prostate cancer prevention trials mounted by NSABP and SWOG. And we participated in the design of all of those and were involved in those. And our part of that effort, if you like, was for lung cancer prevention, and it was with the selenium trial. And that was led by Dan Karp, who, as you probably know, came out of Ki Hong's group also. That didn't turn out the way we wanted it, but it was a very successful study in that it accrued very well and accrued quickly. It had correlative endpoints that were led by Steve Belinsky, and of course he was at a SWOG institution at the time, so it highlighted cross-system collaborations as there were in the other studies too. So that kind of was the history of our involvement in that. And since the end of those studies, until TMIST came along, really, actually, the other screening studies, Mitch, I should hand over to you to talk about the screening studies of imaging, NLST, and so on.
Right. And we on the ACRIN side, we have a rich history in this space, right? Really starting with, our first DMIS trial, the digital mammography trial, which, interestingly enough, if you look at the proliferation of digital mammography, and it wasn't a given that it was equivalent even to standard film screen mammography, there was a lot of concerns. Digital mammography proliferation in the U.S. really came concurrent with the release of the results of the DMIS trial, and followed with multiple other screening trials. We did a CT colonography trial showing that it's relatively effective for centimeter polyps. We did the trial of the NLST trial, which obviously had major impact. Since the merger, we've actually done some additional trials. We did the trial that recently published ABMRI trial for abbreviated breast MR, demonstrating that for patients with radiographically dense breast seeking supplemental screening, that there was a 2.5-fold increase in cancer detection rate by adding an abbreviated breast MR. And so this screening focus has been part of our history and focus, on the ACRIN side for a long time, that we bought into ECOG-ACRIN together, and sort of culminating both with this TMIS trial, as well as the view going forward of sort of an approach to screening that will be much more combined biomarker imaging based, and the need to sort of integrate blood-based biomarkers and imaging approaches together into more effective screening programs, which was something that we're interested in pursuing. Finally, the other thing that we're interested in is trying to think collaboratively between screening and prevention. For a couple of rationales. One is mechanisms used in prevention might also speak to mechanisms used for screening, particularly if we use molecular-based screening approaches. And the second is that the screening component of a prevention trial could represent a way to measure endpoints and serve as a sort of a marker for the effectiveness of the prevention. Peter, any other thoughts?
Well, yeah, you bring up an important nexus. And I think that, my predecessor in this role, Bob Comas and Mitch, saw the potential of this, and, kudos to both, because this is really where bringing together different biomarkers, in particular imaging biomarkers, because they're non-invasive, and clinical markers for trials of various kinds. I think we're really at a remarkable moment when therapeutic advances in genomics and targeted therapies and immunotherapy are set to influence strategies for prevention and screening. And our belief is that that these interventions may have an even greater impact in that setting, in prevention rather than in treating established cancer. So this is the time really for a big focus on this area. And I think that probably underlies the CTAC committee's sense of the whole field.
Right. This is not the time to abandon it just because
Right,
the price tags are high.
Right.
So could we establish the context for another trial, which is really what I'm writing about, which is the EA-2185 pancreatic cyst surveillance trial? I mean, screening and surveillance trials require participation of medical specialists other than oncologists. So what obstacles at NCI may prevent other medical groups, specialty groups, from getting involved? I mean, the radiologists have done pretty well, but who else is out there that you need?
Yeah, Mitch, do you want me to take a stab at that first?
Go for it. I'll pitch in.
This study is a multi-level study. I think that it's really unique in its screening and surveillance focus because it has a primary imaging entry. It addresses the biology of cancer risk. It has correlative studies that'll come around behind the positives on this study and analyze various aspects of risk in the context of this screening. So it has value at a number of levels. I think the context that you bring out, and that is that the individuals who would put patients on this study are not medical oncologists who are the drivers of most of the therapeutic studies. And they are often in specialties outside the traditional cancer research specialties. In this case, gastroenterology and surgical specialties, but also maybe less for this, but to a certain extent, primary care. And all of these, different components of the medical system need to be considered in how the structures are put together to make these trials happen. Historically, the therapeutic approaches have driven those structures, and really a one-size-fits-all for to bring in other specialties may not work as well as it could with a different approach. This is a kind of an unintended consequence of the history of where we are in this type of cancer research. And so we've been in discussions with, particularly with Phil Castle, Ned Sharpless and Wharton McCaskill-Stevens, but also on the CTEP side, which regulates the registration of investigators with Jim Dorshow and Meg Mooney. And we're trying to figure out what are the best structures to allow this to happen, how much of it needs to occur in CTEP versus in the Division of Cancer Prevention or elsewhere, and could we streamline it in such a way as to have something like a registration light for individuals who are not going to be treating patients, who don't need to have their pharmacy information in there, for example, and other aspects that are required by our current registration procedures. So simplifying this, making it easier, ultimately for primary care. Our focus should be on primary care physicians, because if large screening trials are going to ever be implemented, we're going to need the patients, they're not even patients, the subjects, to be screened at the level of their local doctor. So that's a that's a big part of the way that we're thinking about how to engage more people in this process.
And
Mitch?
there's another corollary to what Peter said, and that is in addition to the NCTN structure, which assumes broad participation across a whole portfolio of trials, it also sort of has a single point of contact into a health system or into an institution. And institutions are becoming very complex these days, right? I mean, I'm in the University of Pennsylvania Health System. The University of Pennsylvania Health System is, 6 hospitals, and, we've got, the academic radiology group, we've got private groups, and same thing with, in multiple specialties. And so we have to be more agile how we engage these systems, because the assumption that we can send dollars to the cancer center and they can figure it out are more complex in this complex environment. And so we also need the agility to be able to engage the right constituency within systems that are going to be participating in these trials through contracts and other. And again, we've been talking to NCI about this, with the same groups, as part of this sort of rethinking, because it is a barrier when you're trying to engage a group, who's part of a system, who has very arm's length relationships to the cancer center through the cancer center. We then have to sort of negotiate internally, these sort of internal, relationships, so that can run off, rather than just say, if they're going to enter the patients, let's just directly contract to them and get it over with.
Well, let's say I'm a primary care physician. What would be my obstacles in participating in, say, any of the trials? I don't want to choose one, because I'd probably choose the wrong one. But
under current structures, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you'd have to be registered in the NCTN, which basically means you've got to be qualified to do an NCTN study, including, because I go through this as a radiologist, identify the pharmacy they're going to send the chemotherapy agents to,
the IRB,
right? Deal with, a ton of paperwork to show that I'm capable of being able to treat patients on NCTN trials. Then I would also have to figure out how I'm going to work with my cancer center, so that if there's accrual happens and the dollars will go to the cancer center, that I actually get my costs reimbursed, for me doing that trial. And so you can imagine, if I'm a primary care doc, this sort of bar that holds. And what it means to us as a group, it means that we've got to put a ton of resources into that primary care doc to educate them on what it is to be in the NCTN, to walk them through a bunch of paperwork, most of which are irrelevant to the trial they're going to go on, that they've never seen before, heard before, and really are scared of. To work and try to create a relationship between them and the cancer center that would keep them whole for their costs in participating in the trial. And so, it really creates challenges to getting these folks on these trials.
And Corp's going to have an easier time or a harder time, community docs, not academic docs?
I don't think it much matters. What I say is that, the very large institution, if you're, I think it has to do to a large extent with internally the structure of your organization and how you operate. But if you're an arm's length specialist in terms of participating normally in cancer trials, you're going to be, it doesn't matter whether you're in a big or small place, you're going to suffer from these concerns.
But ultimately, it's really important not to reinvent the wheel here. It's taken us 50 years to get to this point where we have an established nationwide system of cancer research that really works. And so tinkering with the existing system rather than trying to stand up a different but parallel system seems to us, and I think that it's logical, seems to us the best way forward. And I think we're embarked on that over the last year or so, and we'll see some results, I think.
That's worked in the past, right? Before the formal NCTN, there was a little more latitude in how people could get rostered for studies, and there were special rosters developed. I mean, we in Akron had the latitude to be able to engage sites this way. I know, speaking with some of our colleagues in the NCTN, the legacy trials like the STAR trial and some of the other breast cancer prevention trials, they were able to separately roster people that way. So in legacy, before the formality of the NCTN, there was some of that flexibility, which was effective.
So there are recommendations sought by NCI prior to this focused on TMIST. How would you apply those recommendations globally to EA 2185? We touched on some of this, but maybe there's something we forgot.
I mean, I think, again, we touched on a lot of this. I think a key would be to be able to create a separate, if you will, registration light program, and to be able to allow direct engagement, in this case, gastroenterologists and the GI surgeons that are going to primarily be seeing these patients. That way, we could, greatly expand the participant pool, and be closer to where these patients are.
And what kind of changes are you making to your studies? I guess we're getting back to TMIST.
Yeah.
That's probably where it mostly needs to happen. Where is it now? I haven't looked at it in about 6-7 months, so probably missed a bunch.
Well, TMIST is accruing quite well now. We've done some things based on, recommendations of the committee, and frankly, things we were doing ahead of time. And I think you and I may have talked about that. We started to work on some redesigns and have negotiated some of those out with NCI to decrease the total the total sample size a bit, and doing all, the work that I described in getting sort of the non-standard NCTN sites accruing was work that we've been doing all along in TMIST. But you can imagine, each site getting them up and running, because of the effort that it takes, was quite a bit delayed. But now we've got we're solidly accruing between 2,000 and 2,500 patients a month. I don't remember the latest, but I think we're over 65,000 patients in at this point. And so we've been on solid footing on the accrual in TMIST in the last 6 to 12 months.
So at this rate, you would be expecting results when, roughly?
So we're projecting about, I think I'm trying to remember from what date, it was about 2 years till we finished accrual, from about, so probably by now, probably about 18 months or 19 months that we'd be finished accrual. And then we've got follow-up after that. So we'd be expecting results in about, with all the follow-up. It's a funny design, because it's a design that you could end at any time, but something of the order of 4 years of follow-up. So probably about 6 years from now.
What about European data? Can you pool it with Europe or not? Or is that still being discussed?
It's being discussed. There's a lot of nuance about this design that requires some very, because it's not diagnostic based, it's outcome based, in a sense that which I think is becoming even more and more important as we think about, a lot of the challenges that the next generations of screening are going to create, and how important it is for us to be outcomes based. As we become better and better at finding disease, we want to find the disease that matters. So we're looking and we'll consider anything, but at this point, I don't know that we've found some slam dunk data that we can pull.
Is there anything we forgot?
Well, I would say that in terms of the other changes that we're making to our studies, is all in approach that particularly for studies that are going to be challenging or complex, we develop study teams, we tune the composition of those study teams to what skill sets are required to manage them. We have, and I know Diane is on the call, we have a big focus on communication. And I think we're getting better at communicating with our sites and with potential participants. And that's a lot of resource, but we think it's worthwhile, and it's something that we're doing for 2185.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you need to do there?
Yeah, that's what we need to do is to get to a critical mass of participants within the existing participants. We're looking at novel methods of alerting people to the existence of the pancreatic cyst because it can be missed, and because there are criteria for how long the cyst has been there that make a patient eligible or ineligible, and what kind of other tests they might have had. So some of this is actually amenable to an algorithmic approach within particular systems, and that's the approach that we're developing. We think that in that way, I don't know if David mentioned it, that the potential exists for EA 2185 to be a kind of a laboratory environment for what may work in the direction of accruing patients to screening studies. Can we be smarter about it? And that's something we're going to try and work out within that trial.
Right, leveraging the EHR to identify candidates in ways that may be valuable because we're looking through broad populations.
And it's the question, the research question is really fascinating to think about it, because is this stuff pretty benign, or is this going to kill you?
It's a complex design, and those are exactly the issues, and that's why it's valuable.
And the challenge, and I can tell you because I do this for a living, is that the imaging studies are becoming so good that inadvertently we're finding pancreatic cysts are incredibly common, and we've got to get our arms around figuring out how to manage these, because every time somebody's getting a workup because of hematuria and we're looking at their kidneys, every time somebody's getting a workup because of GI distress or because their biliary tract is being worked up, right, we're seeing the pancreas. There's almost an epidemic, of pancreatic cystic lesions. And frankly, this is emblematic. There's corollaries in other areas as well, that our imaging is so good. There's a proliferation of small renal cell carcinomas, for example. And it's not because there's suddenly a proliferation, it's because we're seeing stuff that we've never seen before. And trying to figure out how we should be caring for these patients is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, you're talking about Whipples. I mean, that's
absolutely. That's exactly my point. One man's cure is another man's over treatment, right?
Well, thank you so much for talking with me, and I look forward to writing about this.